Sometimes the loneliest souls are the ones who've convinced themselves they don't need anybody. Sometimes it takes just one gentle heart to remind us what we've been missing all along. Thomas Kane lived alone on Cold Mountain for 15 years, speaking to no one and trusting nothing but his own strength. The townsfolk called him the Hermit, a man so tough he could survive winters that killed everything else. He split his own wood, hunted his own food, and built walls around his heart, thicker than the cabin logs that sheltered him. Then Sarah Mitchell came up that mountain road with her warm brown eyes and gentle hands. She was just supposed to be a maid, someone to help around the cabin. But when she looked at him like he mattered, when she spoke his name with kindness he'd forgotten existed, something broke open inside his chest. For the first time in years, this mountain of a man found himself nervous, unsure, feeling things he thought he'd buried forever. What happens when a heart that's been frozen for 15 years suddenly starts to thaw? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Cold Mountain like a shroud, wrapping around the towering pines and granite peaks that had stood sentinel over Thomas Kane's solitude for 15 long years. From his workshop window, he could see the winding dirt road that snaked up from the valley below. A road he'd traveled exactly once since Rebecca died, and that was only to stock up on supplies before the worst winter on record. Most folks in Pine Ridge thought Thomas Kane had simply vanished after the accident. One day he was Denver's most sought-after finish carpenter, crafting custom cabinets and furniture for the city's finest homes, and the next he was loading his pickup truck with everything that mattered and driving toward the mountains like a man possessed. The truth was simpler and more complicated than the rumors suggested. Thomas hadn't vanished. He had simply stopped believing in tomorrow. The chess set on his kitchen table told a different story than the one whispered in town. Hand-carved from mountain maple over the course of 3 winters, each piece bore the intricate detail that had once made him famous among Denver's elite. The knight's flowing mane, the castle's weathered stone texture, the queen's regal bearing. Every curve and line spoke to the artistic soul that still lived beneath his weathered exterior. He played against himself most evenings, white versus black, logic versus emotion, always ending in stalemate because both sides knew each other too well. Rebecca used to say his hands could coax beauty from anything. A compliment that once filled him with pride and now felt like salt in an old wound. Those same hands that had crafted engagement rings from raw gold and built the frame for their future home now served only to split firewood, skin deer, and maintain the fortress of logs and stone that kept the world at bay. The call from Mountain. Employment services had come on a Tuesday morning in late September, crackling through the old landline he kept for emergencies. A woman's voice, professional but kind, explaining that they had a candidate for housekeeping and general assistance. Thomas had listened with growing irritation, ready to hang up until she mentioned his shoulder. "Mr. Kane, I understand you've been managing everything yourself, but Dr. Martinez in Pine Ridge mentioned you might benefit from some help while that rotator cuff heals properly." Damn Dr. Martinez and his big mouth. The shoulder injury from splitting green oak in the rain had been Thomas's own fault, and he'd only gone to town for treatment because infection had started setting in. One visit to stitch up the gash, and suddenly the whole county thought he was falling apart. "I don't need. The young lady I have in mind just lost her husband," the woman continued gently. "She's looking for a quiet place to work and heal. Something temporary, just until you're back to full strength." Something in her tone had given Thomas pause. The word healing hung in the mountain air long after he'd reluctantly agreed to meet this Sarah Mitchell. He told himself it was practical. His shoulder did ache something fierce, and the cabin could use attention he'd been putting off. But deep down, in a place he'd walled off years ago, curiosity flickered like an ember in cold ash. Sarah Mitchell's story, as Thomas later learned, was written in the same language of loss that had shaped his own isolation. Married at 22 to David Mitchell, a kind man who sold insurance and dreamed of children they never had. 15 years of trying, of doctors and treatments, and hope deferred until hope itself became too painful to bear. Then came the heart attack at 45, sudden, complete, leaving Sarah with a mortgage she couldn't afford and memories too heavy to carry in their shared spaces. She'd sold everything, keeping only what fit in a single worn suitcase and the beat-up Honda Civic that wheezed its way up mountain roads never meant for city cars. The employment agency had been her lifeline, promising work in places where starting over felt possible rather than pathetic. The suitcase sat on Thomas's kitchen. Counter now, brown leather scarred by years of use, brass clasps tarnished but still sturdy. Something about it spoke to him, the way it had endured, the way it held everything someone thought they needed for a new beginning. His own journey to Cold Mountain had required a truck bed full of tools and lumber, but Sarah Mitchell had distilled her entire future into one modest bag. He'd watched her arrive from his workshop, hands stilling on the cabinet door he'd been sanding. The Honda had coughed and wheezed up that final steep grade, vapor streaming from under the hood in the cool mountain air. When she'd stepped out, Thomas had expected someone harder, more weathered by loss. Instead, he saw a woman whose brown hair caught the afternoon light, whose movements held a grace that spoke of inner strength rather than defeat. She'd stood for a long moment, looking up at his cabin with something like wonder. The structure was impressive, Thomas would admit. That much. 2 stories of hand-hewn logs, a wraparound porch supported by posts he'd turned himself, windows positioned to catch both morning and evening light. Every joint was perfect, every beam precisely placed. It was the kind of craftsmanship that had once been his signature, now serving as his sanctuary. Sarah had knocked gently, 3 soft raps that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the woods. Even the jay that had been scolding him from the pine outside his window had gone quiet, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Opening the door, Thomas had found himself looking down into eyes the color of warm earth after rain. She'd smiled, not the bright, forced expression people wore when they were nervous, but something softer, more genuine. "Mr. Kane, I'm Sarah Mitchell. Thank you for giving me this chance." Her voice carried traces of the South, vowels softened by years in gentler climates. When she'd extended her hand, Thomas had hesitated just a moment too long before taking it. Her palm was warm against his calloused skin, her grip firm without trying to prove anything. "Just Thomas," he'd managed, stepping aside to let her enter. "You made good time from Pine Ridge." "Actually, I drove straight through from Nebraska." 22 hours on the road gives you plenty of time to think. She'd moved through his front room with careful attention, taking in the heavy furniture he'd built over the years, the fieldstone fireplace, the kitchen that opened into the main living space. Her gaze had lingered on small details. The way morning light fell across the dining table, the view of the valley through the large front windows, the chess set with its game frozen mid-play. "This is beautiful work," she'd said, running her fingers along the edge of his handmade dining table. "You built all of this?" "Most of it." Thomas had found himself watching her face, looking for judgment or pity, and finding neither. "The bones of the cabin were already here when I bought the land. Previous owner started it, never finished, and you finished what he couldn't." Something in the way she'd said it, like it meant more than just carpentry, had made Thomas's chest tighten unexpectedly. He'd shown her to the small bedroom off the kitchen, originally meant to be a pantry, but modified with a window and proper. A door, clean sheets, a quilt his grandmother had made decades ago, a small dresser he'd built during his second winter on the mountain. "It's not much," he'd said, suddenly aware of how sparse everything looked. "It's perfect." Sarah had set her suitcase on the bed and turned back to him with that same gentle smile. "When would you like me to start?" The question had caught him off guard. Most people would have asked about wages, about duties, about how long the arrangement might last. Sarah Mitchell had simply accepted what was offered and asked how she could be useful. "Tomorrow's fine," he'd said. "I usually get up before dawn, but there's no need for you to—" "I'm an early riser too. Lost the habit of sleeping in years ago." That first night, Thomas had lain in his bed upstairs listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in his space. The soft creak of floorboards as she'd moved around the small room, the whisper of fabric as she'd unpacked her few belongings, the quiet click of the lamp switch when she'd finally settled in for the night. For 15 years, the cabin had held only his breathing, his footsteps, his solitary routine. Now there was something else, a presence that changed the very air he breathed. He'd stared at the ceiling rafters he'd hand-hewn and fitted, wondering what he'd gotten himself into, wondering if the employment agency woman had been right about healing requiring more than just time and isolation. The chess set downstairs seemed to mock him in the darkness. All those years of playing against himself, and now he couldn't even predict his next move. Thomas woke to the smell of coffee brewing and bacon frying, scents that had been absent from his cabin for so long they felt like memories made manifest. For a moment, lying in the pre-dawn darkness, he could almost believe he was dreaming. Then Sarah's voice drifted up from the kitchen, humming something soft and melodic, and reality settled over him like a weight. He'd always been first up, first to stoke the fire, first to start the day's survival. The routine had kept him sane through 15 winters of solitude. Now, lying in his bed while someone else moved through his space, he felt displaced in his own home. Downstairs, Sarah stood at his wood-burning stove, tending to cast iron pans. With the confidence of someone who'd cooked on temperamental equipment before, she'd found his good plates, the ones he'd made himself from local clay during his 4th year on the mountain, and set 2 places at the table. The chess set had been moved to the counter, pieces arranged neatly in their starting positions. "Good. Morning," she said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind. I'm not much good at sitting still, and the bacon was going to spoil anyway." Thomas grunted something that might have been thanks and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made. It was stronger than his usual brew, richer somehow. He'd been drinking the same bitter chicory blend for years, buying it in bulk from the general store in Pine Ridge. This tasted like it came from somewhere that cared about flavor. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." Sarah turned, spatula in, and he caught his first full look at her in morning light. She'd braided her hair back, revealing the line of her neck and the small scar near her left ear that spoke of childhood accidents and scraped knees. Her clothes were practical, jeans worn soft with age, a flannel shirt that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. Besides, "This is what you're paying me for, isn't it?" He wasn't paying her much, barely enough to cover food and basic needs. They'd settled on an amount that felt more like charity than wages, though Sarah had insisted it was fair for room and board, plus light housework. Looking at the careful way she'd arranged everything, the obvious effort she'd put into making his rough kitchen feel welcoming, Thomas felt the first stirrings of guilt. Breakfast passed in careful conversation. Sarah asked about his shoulder, about the best places to buy supplies in Pine Ridge, about whether the road stayed passable all winter. Safe questions, the kind strangers asked to fill silence. Thomas answered in sentences that revealed nothing. Personal, though he found himself watching her face as she listened. She had a way of giving her full attention to whatever was in front of her. His words, the food, the view out the window, where a red squirrel was performing acrobatics on the bird feeder he'd forgotten he owned. There was something restful about being around someone who wasn't constantly looking past the moment to whatever came next. After breakfast, Sarah began what she called getting acquainted with the house. Thomas retreated to his workshop, telling himself he had plenty to do on the cabinet commission that would keep him busy until winter. But he found himself pausing in his work, listening to her movements overhead as she explored rooms he'd barely entered in months. It was while she was cleaning the front room that she found them. "Thomas!" Her voice carried a note he couldn't identify. "Could you come here for a moment?" He found her standing beside the bookshelf he'd built into the wall near the fireplace, holding a small wooden box he'd forgotten existed. Inside, visible, through the open lid, were photographs. Rebecca at the lake where they'd gotten engaged. Rebecca in her wedding dress that she'd never gotten to wear. Rebecca laughing at something he'd said while they painted the trim on their Denver house. The box sat in Sarah's hands like an accusation. Thomas felt his throat close, felt the familiar surge of panic and anger that came whenever the past intruded on his carefully constructed present. "I was dusting," Sarah said gently. "The box was behind some books. I didn't mean to pry, but when it opened, put it back." The words came out harsher than he'd intended. "Just put it back where you found it." Sarah's eyes, those warm brown eyes that had seemed so kind at breakfast, now held something else. Understanding, maybe, or pity. Both options made Thomas's chest tighten with unwelcome emotion. "She was beautiful," Sarah said, looking down at the photograph on top. Rebecca at 26, golden hair catching sunlight, smile bright enough to power cities. What was her name? Rebecca. The name felt rusty in his mouth. He hadn't said it aloud in years. Her name was Rebecca. "How long were you together?" The question was quiet, careful, but it hit Thomas like a physical blow. How long? How do you measure the time between finding your other half and watching them die? How do you explain that? 3 years can contain a lifetime of love and a forever of loss. "Long enough," he said, and reached for the box. Sarah's fingers brushed his as she handed it over, and the contact sent an unexpected jolt through his system. Not desire exactly, but recognition. The simple human connection he'd been avoiding. For 15 years. He jerked his hand back as if burned, and the box slipped, photographs scattering across the hardwood floor he'd laid himself. They knelt at the same time to gather the scattered memories. Sarah's movements were careful, reverent, as if she understood she was handling pieces of someone's heart. She picked up a photo of Rebecca in their unfinished kitchen, hammer in hand, grinning at the camera with the pride of someone building their future one nail at a time. "She looks happy," Sarah said softly. "You both do." Thomas found himself looking at the photo through Sarah's eyes, seeing not just the loss, but the joy that had existed before it. Rebecca covered in sawdust, celebrating the completion of their kitchen cabinets. He'd taken the picture on the day they'd finished, the day before she'd driven to meet her sister for lunch and never made it home. The admission slipped out before he could stop it. "We were planning. We had plans." His voice broke on the last word, and suddenly Thomas was 28 again, standing in a hospital hallway while a doctor explained about impact. Engels and traumatic brain injuries, and how sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, some things couldn't be fixed. Sarah's hand touched his shoulder, just briefly, just enough to ground him in the present moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry for your loss." The words were simple, honest, free of the platitudes people usually offered. No mention of God's plan or better places, or how Rebecca wouldn't want him to suffer, just acknowledgement of the fact that losing someone you love feels like losing part of yourself. "It was 15 years ago," Thomas said, as if time could diminish. The ache. "Car accident. She was coming home from—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence he'd never spoken aloud. "You don't have to tell me." Sarah gathered the remaining photographs and placed them gently back in the box. "But if you ever want to, I'm a good listener." Thomas took the box and stood, his injured shoulder protesting the movement. He should put it back where it belonged, hidden behind books and dust and willful forgetting. Instead, he found himself holding it like it contained something precious rather than painful. "She would have liked you," he said, the words surprising him as much as they seemed to surprise Sarah. "Rebecca always said I was too serious, that I needed someone to remind me how to smile." Sarah's own smile was soft, sad around the edges. Maybe she still is, reminding you, I mean, The idea hit Thomas like a physical blow. Rebecca somehow orchestrating this meeting across 15 years and the vast distance between life and death. It was the kind of romantic notion she would have loved, the kind of thing she would have believed in completely. And for the first time since he'd buried her, Thomas felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking, but beginning to heal. Set the box on the mantel where he could see it, where Rebecca's smile could watch over whatever came next. When he turned back, Sarah was watching him with something like pride in her eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For not telling me it was time to let go." Sarah nodded, understanding somehow that letting go and moving forward weren't the same thing. "The heart's got room for more than one kind of love," she said. "Keeping her memory doesn't mean closing the door on everything else." Thomas looked at this woman who'd appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he'd been too afraid to voice, and felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought was buried forever. The morning after the photograph incident, Thomas found Sarah on his front porch at sunrise, struggling with his grandfather's splitting axe. The tool was nearly as tall as she was, its head heavy with decades of use and the weight of family history. She'd managed to position a log on the chopping block, but her stance was all wrong. Feet too close together, grip too tight, shoulders tensed for disaster. "You're going to hurt yourself," Thomas said, stepping down from the porch. Sarah looked up, hair escaping from her ponytail, cheeks flushed with effort and frustration. "I thought I could help with the firewood. Back in Nebraska, David and I had a little wood-burning stove in our basement. I watched him split kindling 100 times. Watching and doing are different things." Thomas moved behind her, close enough to smell the clean scent of her shampoo mixed with morning mountain. May I?" She nodded, and he reached around her to adjust her grip on the axe handle. His arms bracketed hers, his chest nearly touching her back as he repositioned her hands. The contact sent awareness shooting through him, the warmth of her body, the way she fit against him like she belonged there. "Feet wider," he said, his voice rougher than intended. He used his boots to nudge her feet into proper position, trying to ignore the way her breath caught when his hands covered hers. "The power comes from your whole body, not just your arms. Let gravity help." He guided her through the motion, up, pause, down with controlled force. The axe bit into the wood with a satisfying thunk, splitting the log cleanly in two. Sarah made a small sound of triumph that did unexpected things to Thomas's equilibrium. "Like that?" she asked, turning her head to look at him. They were close enough that he could count the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough that he could see the small freckle just beside her left nostril. Just like that. He stepped back quickly, putting distance between them before he did. "Something foolish. Try it on your own now." Sarah's next swing was still awkward, but the log split. Her face lit up with pleasure that seemed entirely out of proportion to the achievement, and Thomas felt something warm unfurl in his chest. When had he last seen someone take such joy in small victories? They worked together for the next hour, Thomas offering quiet corrections, while Sarah found her rhythm with the axe. She was stronger than she looked, and more determined. When she missed her target and the axe bit into the chopping block, she simply repositioned the log and tried again. "This was your grandfather's?" she asked during a break, running her fingers along the worn handle. "His father's before that. Made the handle myself when I was 16. The original had cracked." Thomas accepted the water bottle she offered, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Grandpa said an axe was like a marriage, only as good as the care you put into it." Sounds like he was a wise man, wise enough to know that some things are worth maintaining. Thomas took a long drink, using the time to study Sarah's profile as she examined the axe head. "He taught me most of what I know about woodworking, about taking care of tools and land." "Is that why you came here? To honor his teachings?" The question was asked without guile, but it cut deeper than Sarah probably intended. Thomas had told himself many things about his retreat to Cold Mountain, that he needed solitude, that he preferred independence, that the mountain air was good for his health. The truth was simpler and more complicated. He'd come here to disappear. I came here to forget, he said, surprising himself with the honesty. Didn't work out the way I planned. Sarah leaned the axe against the chopping block and turned to face him fully. Maybe forgetting isn't the point. Maybe it's about learning to carry the weight differently. Her words hung in the morning air between them, profound in their simplicity. Thomas had spent 15 years trying to bury his memories, to numb himself with solitude and routine. Sarah was suggesting something else entirely, transformation rather than elimination. You sound like you speak from experience, he said. 22 months of grief counseling after David died. Sarah's smile was wry, but not bitter. Turns out, avoiding your feelings just makes them stronger. Who knew? Thomas found himself almost smiling at her dry humor. Learn anything useful? That healing isn't a destination. It's a practice. Some days are better than others. She picked up another log and positioned it on the block. And that sometimes the best thing you can do for your grief is give it some company. She swung the axe with more confidence now, the blade biting cleanly through the wood. Thomas watched the smooth motion of her shoulders, the determined set of her jaw, the way morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair. When had he last noticed such details about another person? They spent the rest of the morning working together. Thomas teaching, Sarah learning. He showed her how to sharpen the axe blade, how to read the grain of different woods, how to stack split logs for proper seasoning. She listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that knowledge was a gift, asking questions that showed she was thinking beyond the immediate task. "Why do you stack them bark side down?" she asked as they arranged the fresh splits in his woodshed. "Bark sheds water. Stack them bark up, and rain pools on top, seeps down into the wood. Bark down, water runs off, and the wood stays dry. Makes sense." Sarah positioned another piece, copying his technique. "Everything here has a purpose, doesn't it? Every detail thought through." Thomas paused in his stacking. She was right. Every aspect of his mountain life had been carefully planned for maximum efficiency and self-sufficiency. But hearing her say it made him wonder when purpose had become prison, when careful planning had become rigid isolation. 15 years of learning from mistakes, he said. Mountain doesn't forgive carelessness. Neither does grief, Sarah said, quietly. But it can teach you things if you let it. They worked in comfortable silence after that, the rhythm of shared labor creating its own form of communication. Thomas found himself stealing glances at Sarah as she learned to read the wood grain, as she adapted her technique to different log sizes, as she unconsciously hummed while she worked. The humming stopped him cold. It was something soft and wordless, probably unconscious on her part, but it filled the spaces between their movements with melody, turning work into something warmer, more alive. Rebecca used to hum while she cooked, while she painted, while she worked in their garden. The memory should have been painful, but somehow, with Sarah's voice weaving through the mountain air, it felt like blessing instead of burden. When they finished stacking the wood, Sarah stood back to admire their work with obvious satisfaction. Her clothes were streaked with bark and sawdust. Her hair had escaped its ponytail entirely, and there was a smudge of dirt across her left cheek. Thomas had never seen anyone look more beautiful. "Thank you," she said, turning to him with that warm smile that seemed to light up everything around her. "I haven't felt this useful in years. Thank you for the help, and for—" Thomas gestured toward the neat stacks of firewood, but he meant something larger. For bringing music back to his mornings, for making work feel like companionship, for reminding him what it felt like to share simple pleasures with another person. "For what?" Sarah asked. Thomas looked at this woman who'd appeared in his carefully, ordered life like spring water in a desert, and felt something shift in his chest. Not breaking, not even cracking, but opening, like a door that had been locked for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "For reminding me that some things are better when they're shared," he said. Sarah's smile softened, became something more intimate than casual pleasure. "I'm glad I could help." Standing there in the morning light, surrounded by the fruits of their shared labor, Thomas felt the first whisper of possibility. Maybe Sarah was right about grief needing company. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting, but about finding new ways to honor both the past and the present. Maybe it was time to stop living like a man with nothing left to lose. 3 days later, Thomas discovered Sarah on his back porch at sunset, holding a silver pocket watch and crying. Not the harsh, breaking sobs of fresh grief, but the quiet tears of someone revisiting old sorrows. She sat in the rocking chair he'd built during his second winter, the one that had never quite fit right, because he'd made it too narrow, too stiff, like everything else in his mountain life. He almost retreated, unwilling to intrude on private pain. But something about the way she held the watch, carefully, like it might break, made him step forward instead. "I'm sorry," Sarah said when she noticed him, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I didn't mean to. This is your space. I can go inside?" No need." Thomas settled onto the porch steps, giving her room but not leaving her alone. "Mind if I ask what's got you stirred up?" Sarah turned the watch over in her palm, running her thumb across its engraved surface. "Today would have been David's 48th birthday. 15 years of marriage, and I never once forgot to get him a card. Today I woke up, and it took me until sunset to remember." She said it like a confession, like forgetting was a betrayal instead of a sign of healing. Thomas understood that particular guilt, the way grief made you feel responsible for honoring the dead in ways that slowly strangled the living. "Tell me about him," Thomas said. "About David." Sarah looked surprised by the request. "You want to hear about my dead husband? I want to understand what you lost." Thomas settled more comfortably on the steps, prepared to listen. Sometimes talking about them helps. Sometimes it doesn't, but the choice should be yours. Sarah was quiet for so long, Thomas thought she might refuse. Then she opened the watch, revealing a photograph tucked inside the cover. A man with kind eyes and thinning brown hair, smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of someone who'd never expected life to blindside him. "David was steady," she said finally, "the kind of man who never forgot anniversaries or left dishes in the sink overnight. He sold insurance, which sounds boring, but he was good at it because he genuinely cared about protecting people. He'd spend hours with elderly clients, making sure they understood their policies, that their families would be taken care of." She paused, running her finger along the watch's chain. "He wanted children so badly it hurt. We tried for years, doctors, treatments, specialists who promised miracles and delivered heartbreak. David never blamed me, never made me feel like I was failing him, even when I blamed myself." Thomas heard the weight in her words, the echo of dreams deferred and hope exhausted. "That must have been hard on both of you." "It was. But we thought we had time. David always said we'd figure it out. Adoption, fostering, something. He was convinced we'd find our way to the family we wanted." Sarah's voice caught slightly. "Then one morning he was loading the dishwasher before work, complaining about his back hurting from yard work the day before. By noon, he was gone. Massive heart attack at 45, with no warning, no history of heart problems." She closed the watch with a soft click. "The paramedics said he probably died instantly. They meant it as comfort, I think. No suffering, no chance to be afraid. But all I could think was that he left for work without kissing me goodbye because we'd had a stupid argument about whether to replace the kitchen faucet." Thomas felt the familiar ache of recognition, the way sudden loss could make every small moment feel either precious or inadequate. How many mornings had he left for the workshop without properly saying goodbye to Rebecca? How many ordinary moments had he failed to treasure because he'd assumed there would be infinite more? "Grief has a way of editing memory," he said quietly. "It highlights the regrets and dims the good times. Is that what happened with you, with Rebecca?" The question was gentle but direct, and Thomas found himself considering it seriously. Had grief distorted his memories of Rebecca, turning their relationship into something more perfect and therefore more irreplaceable than it had actually been? "Maybe," he admitted. I remember her as perfect, which probably isn't fair to either of us. Perfect people don't exist, but perfect love, that's something else. David wasn't perfect, Sarah said with a small smile. He left his socks on the bathroom floor and ate cereal for dinner when I worked late. He could never remember which setting to use on the washing machine, but he was perfect for me, you know. We fit. Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Rebecca had been terrible with money, always bringing home stray animals I couldn't afford to keep, singing off-key in the shower every morning. But she'd also been the first person to truly see him, to value his quiet nature instead of trying to change it. David gave me this watch for our 10th anniversary, Sarah continued. Said it was so I'd always have his time, even when he couldn't be with me. I used to think it was the corniest thing in the world. And now it's all I have left of him that still ticks. She wound the watch carefully, listening to its steady rhythm. Sometimes I hate that it keeps working when he doesn't. Sometimes I'm grateful. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun finished setting behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the whole world look like it was burning gently. Thomas found himself oddly at peace with Sarah's tears, with her need to honor David's memory, with the complicated nature of loving people you couldn't keep. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said eventually. "Sure. Do you think Rebecca would want you to be happy? Really happy, not just surviving?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow, partly because he'd been asking himself the same thing for days, and partly because he already knew the answer. Rebecca had been many things, but selfish wasn't one of them. She'd wanted his happiness more than her own, had been willing to sacrifice her own dreams for his success. "Yes," he said simply. "Rebecca believed in second chances, in making the most of whatever time you got. She would have hated knowing I spent 15 years hiding from life." "David would have been furious with me for wallowing," Sarah admitted. "He always said I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. But it's hard to feel strong when half of yourself is missing." Thomas looked at this woman who'd lost as much as he had, who carried her grief with grace instead of bitterness, and felt something shift in his understanding of strength. Maybe courage wasn't about being invulnerable. Maybe it was about being willing to risk vulnerability again. "You seem pretty strong to me," he said. "Takes guts to start over in a place like this." "Takes guts to let a stranger into your fortress," Sarah countered. "Especially when that fortress has kept you safe for 15 years. Their eyes met in the gathering darkness, and Thomas felt the air between them change. Suddenly they weren't just two people sharing stories about their dead spouses. They were a man and woman recognizing something in each other, acknowledging the possibility of connection despite the risks. "Sarah," Thomas said, her name feeling strange and right on his tongue. "I know," she said softly. "I feel it too." The admission hung between them like a bridge, something they could cross or burn, depending on how much courage they could muster. Thomas thought about Rebecca's last letter, the one he'd never been able to read completely, where she'd written something about love being too precious to waste on fear. He stood up slowly, his injured shoulder protesting the movement, and extended his hand to Sarah. She looked at it for a long moment, understanding that accepting it meant accepting the possibility of caring about someone new, of risking loss again. Finally, she took his hand and let him help her to her feet. They stood close enough to touch, close enough that Thomas could see the tears still clinging to her eyelashes, close enough that he could lean down and kiss her if he had the courage. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently and said, "Thank you for telling me about David. He sounds like he was a good man. Thank you for listening," Sarah replied. "And Thomas, I think Rebecca would be proud of the man you've become, even in your grief. Especially in your grief." As they walked back into the cabin together, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. The fragile, terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start living again. The workshop had Been Thomas's sanctuary for 15 years, the one place on Cold Mountain where he could lose himself completely in the rhythm of creation. Hand tools hung in precise order on walls he'd built himself, each one cleaned and oiled and returned to its exact place after use. The smell of wood shavings and linseed oil had become his meditation, his escape from thoughts that cut too deep. So when he found Sarah standing in the doorway on a crisp October morning, running her fingers along the frame of his unfinished rocking chair, he felt simultaneously invaded and oddly pleased. No one had been in his workshop since Rebecca's death. Even Dr. Martinez, on his one visit to check Thomas's shoulder, had been firmly directed to the kitchen table for the examination. "I'm sorry," Sarah said when she noticed him. "I heard the sound of your plane and followed the noise. I hope you don't mind." Thomas set down the hand plane he'd been using to smooth a cabinet door and studied her face. She looked genuinely concerned about intruding, but her eyes held something else, wonder maybe, or recognition. She was seeing his work the way Rebecca used to, with appreciation for both the skill and the soul that went into each piece. "It's fine," he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. "Just finishing up a commission before winter sets in." Sarah moved deeper into the workshop, her gaze taking in the half-completed cabinet, the racks of seasoning lumber, the delicate scrollwork on a table leg that waited for final assembly. But her attention kept returning to the rocking chair that sat in the corner like an accusation, beautiful and abandoned. "This is incredible work," she said, running her hand along the chair's curved arm. "The detail in this carving, it's like sculpture." Thomas followed her gaze to the chair he'd started 16 years ago, back when the future had seemed full of possibilities instead of endings. He'd designed it specifically for Rebecca, proportioned to her smaller frame, carved with the climbing roses that had been her favorite flower. The seat was shaped and sanded, the rockers fitted and balanced, but the final assembly remained undone. "It was going to be a surprise," he said, the words coming out rusty with disuse. "Rebecca's birthday present. I was planning to finish it while she was visiting her sister that weekend." Sarah's hand stilled on the wood. "The weekend yeah." Thomas picked up a piece of sandpaper and began working it along the cabinet door, needing something to do with his hands. "After the funeral, I couldn't stand to look at it. Couldn't finish it, couldn't throw it away, so it just sits there, reminding me of all the things I never got to give her. Have you thought about completing it?" The question was asked quietly without judgment, but it hit Thomas like a physical blow. Complete it? For whom? Rebecca was gone, and he had no use for a rocking chair designed for someone who would never sit in it. "No point," he said. "It was made for her. Without Rebecca, it's just wood." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the carved roses with obvious appreciation for the craftsmanship. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle, but firm. "I think it's more than wood. I think it's love given form, a dream made tangible. Those things don't stop mattering just because circumstances change." Thomas looked up from his sanding. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe the chair isn't about Rebecca anymore. Maybe it's about you, about honoring the love you shared by completing something beautiful," she inspired. Sarah moved to face him directly. "Maybe finishing it is a way of saying that love doesn't end when people do." The idea was simultaneously appealing and terrifying. Thomas had avoided the chair for 15 years because it represented hope unfulfilled, promises broken by forces beyond his control. But Sarah was proposing something different, that completion could be its own form of healing. "I wouldn't know how to start," he admitted. "Every time I look at it, all I see is failure." "Then maybe you need a different pair of eyes." Sarah picked up one of the loose spindles that would eventually support the chair's back. "Tell me about the design. What made you choose climbing roses?" Despite himself, Thomas found his resistance softening. He'd never had anyone to talk to about his work, about the thought process that went into each piece. Rebecca had appreciated the results, but she'd never understood the journey from concept to completion. "Rebecca had a garden back in Denver," he said, setting down his sandpaper. She grew these incredible climbing roses, pink and cream-colored, with the most amazing scent. She'd sit on the back porch in the evenings, reading while they bloomed. Around her, when I designed the chair, I wanted to capture that feeling of being surrounded by beauty she'd created. Sarah nodded, running her thumb along the partially carved petals. You can see it in the work, the way the roses seem to climb. Up the spindles, how they frame where her head would rest. It's like you were building her a garden she could carry with her. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. Sarah understood what he'd been trying to create, saw the intention behind every curve and line. More than that, she seemed to appreciate the love that had guided his hands through hundreds of hours of careful carving. The joinery is what's been stopping me, he admitted. I had this idea for connecting the pieces without visible hardware, everything held together by perfect fits and tension, but the tolerances are so tight that one mistake ruins months of work. Show me, Sarah said simply. For the next hour, Thomas found himself explaining woodworking techniques he'd never shared with another soul. He showed Sarah how the mortise and tenon joints were cut, how the rockers were laminated and shaped, how the carved roses were integrated into the structural elements without weakening them. She listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested, asking questions that showed she was thinking beyond the surface. It's like you're solving a three-dimensional puzzle, she said, as he demonstrated how the backrest would fit into the side rails. Every piece has to be perfect for the whole thing to work. That's exactly what it is. Thomas felt a flush of pleasure at her understanding. Most furniture hides its mistakes with glue and hardware. This design forgives nothing. Maybe that's what makes it beautiful, Sarah said. The fact that it demands perfection, that every piece has to be worthy of the whole. Thomas looked at the scattered components of the chair, months of work represented in shaped wood and careful joints, and for the first time in 15 years he could see the finished piece, not as a monument to loss, but as a testament to the kind of love that inspired excellence. I could probably finish it before winter, he said, the words surprising him. If I worked on it consistently, maybe 6 weeks. I'd love to watch, Sarah said, if you wouldn't mind the company. Thomas studied her face, looking for signs of pity or forced enthusiasm. Instead, he found genuine interest and something that looked like respect for the craft itself. The idea of sharing his workshop, of having someone witness the careful process of creation, felt both foreign and appealing. It might be boring, he warned. Lots of measuring and test fitting, not much to see until the very end. I don't think anything you do could be boring, Sarah said with a smile that made his pulse quicken unexpectedly. Besides, I have a feeling there's more to learn here than just woodworking. As if to prove her point, she picked up one of his hand planes and held it properly, testing its weight and balance. David was handy with basic repairs, but nothing like this. This is artistry. Thomas felt an unexpected surge of pride at her words, followed immediately by guilt. Was he being disloyal to Rebecca's memory by enjoying Sarah's appreciation? Or was Sarah right about love taking new forms, about honoring the past by embracing the present? Your husband was a good man, Thomas said carefully, but he was lucky to have someone who saw the beauty in what he could create. I think we were both lucky, Sarah said softly, to have love that inspired us to be better than we thought we could be. The words hung in the workshop air, weighted with meaning that went beyond their conversation about craftsmanship. Thomas felt the truth of them settle into his bones, the recognition that the best kinds of love didn't diminish you but expanded your capacity for creation, for growth, for becoming more than you'd imagined possible. Rebecca used to say that, he said quietly, that love should make you reach higher, try harder. I haven't felt that way about anything in 15 years. And now? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked at the unfinished chair, then at Sarah standing in the golden afternoon light that slanted through his workshop windows. For the first time since Rebecca's death, he could envision completion, not just of the rocking chair, but of the life he'd put on hold. "Now I think maybe it's time to remember what that feels like," he said. Sarah's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, full of warmth and possibility. "Then let's build something beautiful together," she said, and Thomas knew she wasn't talking only about the chair. The blizzard arrived 3 days later without warning, turning Cold Mountain into a world of white silence. Thomas had lived through enough mountain storms to recognize the signs, the particular stillness in the air, the way animals went quiet, the feeling of pressure building behind his eyes. But this one caught him off guard with its ferocity, dumping 2 feet of snow in the first 6 hours and showing no signs of stopping. He found Sarah standing at the kitchen window at dawn, watching the wind drive snow horizontal across the cleared space around his cabin. She'd made coffee and started breakfast, maintaining the routine they'd fallen into over the past weeks, but her movements carried an edge of nervous energy. "How long do these usually last?" she asked, as Thomas joined her at the window. "Could be hours, could be days." He studied the way the snow was falling, thick, heavy flakes that spoke of a storm system settling in for a long stay. "Good thing we got that extra firewood split. We'll be burning through it fast to keep the pipes from freezing." Sarah nodded, but he could see the worry in her eyes. City living hadn't prepared her for the reality of being completely cut off from the outside world, dependent entirely on whatever supplies they had on hand. Thomas felt a familiar surge of protective instinct, the need to ensure her safety, to shield her from the mountain's indifferent power. "We'll be fine," he said, meaning it. "Cabins built to handle anything the mountain can throw at us. Plenty of food, plenty of fuel. Just have to wait it out." The storm lasted 4 days. By the second morning, they'd fallen into a rhythm shaped by necessity and proximity. Thomas tended the fires, monitored the generator, checked the roof for ice dam. Formation. Sarah managed their food supplies, cooked meals that stretched their provisions, and found ways to make the cabin feel warm, despite the howling wind outside. But it was the evenings that changed everything. With no electricity, except what the generator provided for essentials, they found themselves drawn to the main room after dinner, sitting by the fire while the storm raged outside. Sarah had discovered his collection of books, classics he'd accumulated over the years but rarely opened, and began reading aloud while Thomas worked on smaller projects by lamplight. Her voice transformed everything. Pride and Prejudice became a conversation about the nature of first impressions and second chances. Thoreau's reflections on solitude took on new meaning when shared with someone who understood both its gifts and its limitations. Even the poetry collection Rebecca had given him years ago, dusty and untouched since her death, came alive when Sarah read it by firelight. "Listen to this," Sarah said on the third night, reading from a worn volume of Robert Frost. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep." She looked up from the book, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. "Do you think he's talking about death, or just about the work that remains to be done?" Thomas considered the question while he carved delicate leaves into a cabinet door. Pull. Sarah had a way of asking things that made him think beyond surface meanings, that invited deeper conversation. "Maybe both," he said. "Maybe the promise isn't about dying or living, but about making the most of whatever time you have." "What promises do you think you still need to keep?" Sarah asked quietly. The question hit Thomas unexpectedly. For 15 years, he'd thought his only promise was to Rebecca's memory, to honor her by preserving their love in amber, untouched and unchanging. But sitting here with Sarah, listening to her voice weave magic out of written words, he wondered if he'd misunderstood what Rebecca would have wanted from him. "I promised her I'd always take care of myself," he said slowly. "I don't think hiding on a mountain for 15 years is what she had in mind." Sarah set the book aside and moved closer to the fire, close enough that Thomas could see the way the light caught the auburn highlights in her hair. "What do you think she would want for you now?" Thomas thought about Rebecca's laugh, her irrepressible optimism, her fierce belief that life was meant to be lived fully. She'd never been content with half measures or safe choices. Even their relationship had been a leap of faith. Two people from different worlds who'd chosen to build something together despite the risks. "She'd want me to be happy," he admitted. "Really happy, not just surviving. She'd probably be furious that I've wasted so much time." "I don't think any time spent grieving someone you loved is wasted," Sarah said gently. "But maybe there's a difference between honoring someone's memory and being imprisoned by it." That night they talked until the fire burned low and the storm seemed to quiet outside. Sarah shared stories about her marriage to David, not just the sanitized memories she'd offered before, but the real, complicated truth of loving someone deeply enough to forgive their flaws. Thomas found himself reciprocating, telling her about Rebecca's terrible cooking and her habit of leaving art supplies scattered throughout their house, about fights they'd had and dreams they'd shared. "She sounds like she was quite a woman," Sarah said as they prepared to bank the fire for the night. "She was, but so are you." The words slipped out before Thomas could stop them, honest and unguarded. Sarah looked at him with something like surprise, then smiled, soft and warm and infinitely gentle. "Thank you for that." They stood in the dying firelight, close enough to touch, awareness crackling between them like static electricity. Thomas felt the pull of attraction, the desire to close the distance between them, to find out if Sarah's lips were as soft as they looked. But underneath the physical longing was something deeper, the recognition that this woman had become essential to his happiness in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. "Sarah," he said, her name a question and a prayer. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." This time, when Thomas reached for her, she didn't pull away. Her hand was warm in his, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones, as if they'd been designed to fit together. They stood like that for a long moment, holding hands like teenagers, letting the reality of their connection settle around them. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted quietly. "So am I." Thomas brushed a strand of hair away from her face, marveling at the softness of her skin. "But maybe being scared together is better than being safe alone." When he kissed her, it was with 15 years of stored tenderness, gentle and reverent and full of questions neither of them was ready to answer. Sarah kissed him back with equal care, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, where his heart was beating hard enough to power. The cabin. They broke apart slowly, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. "This changes things," Sarah said. "Everything," Thomas agreed. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Cold Mountain, but inside the cabin, two people who'd thought they were finished with love discovered they were just getting started. The sea. Letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, carried up the mountain by a postal worker who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Thomas signed for it without thinking, assuming it was another commission inquiry or property tax notice. It wasn't until he saw Sarah's face when he handed her the certified envelope that he realized something was wrong. Her name was written across the front in formal script, Ms. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. The return address belonged to Whitmore, Hastings and Associates, attorneys at law, Boston, Massachusetts. Sarah stared at the envelope like it might bite her, her coffee growing, cold in her forgotten mug. "Aren't you going to open it?" Thomas asked, settling into the chair across from her at their kitchen table. Over the past month since the storm, everything in the cabin had become theirs. Shared spaces, shared routines, shared quiet moments. That felt more intimate than any passionate declaration. "I know what it is," Sarah said quietly. "I've been dreading this call for 2 years. She opened the envelope with careful precision, unfolding the legal documents inside like they contained explosives. Thomas watched her face change as she read, surprise giving way to shock, then to something that looked like panic. "What is it?" he asked when she'd been silent for too long. Sarah looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of impossible choices. My great-aunt Millicent died 3 months ago. She left me her estate. Thomas frowned, not understanding why this news would cause such distress. That sounds like it could be good news, depending on the estate. $17 million, Sarah said flatly, plus properties in Boston and Martha's Vineyard, plus a trust fund that generates about $2 million a year in income. The number hit Thomas like a physical blow. $17 million. It was more money than most people saw in several lifetimes. Enough to buy entire towns, enough to guarantee security for generations, enough to make their quiet life on Cold Mountain seem like poverty by comparison. I don't understand, Thomas said, struggling to process what she'd told him. You said you were struggling financially after David died. If you had family money, I didn't know about it. Sarah's voice was hollow, distant. Aunt Millicent and I exchanged Christmas cards, nothing more. She was my grandmother's sister, and the family had some kind of falling out before I was born. I thought she was just a spinster schoolteacher living in a Boston apartment. Thomas studied the legal documents spread across their table, trying to make sense of the situation. The language was dense, full of legal terminology, but certain phrases jumped out at him. Sole beneficiary, immediate inheritance, residence requirement. There's a catch, Sarah continued, her voice growing smaller. To claim the inheritance, I have to establish legal residence in Boston within 30 days of notification. And I have to maintain that residence for a minimum of 1 year. The words settled between them, like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward to touch everything they'd built together. Thomas felt the familiar clutch of abandonment in his chest, the old fear that everyone he cared about would eventually leave him. When do you have to decide? He asked, proud that his voice came out steady. The 30 days started when Aunt Millicent died. Sarah looked at the date on the letter. I have 18 days left. 18 days. Thomas did the math automatically. Barely. Enough time to get Sarah's affairs in order, pack her belongings, and travel to Boston. Certainly not enough time to fight the decision or explore alternatives. You have to take it, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. $17 million. That's generational wealth, security for the rest of your life. Sarah looked at him with something like desperation. I don't want generational wealth. I want this, us, the cabin, the life we're building together. Sarah, be realistic. Thomas forced himself to think practically, to push aside his own desires and focus on what was best for her. You're talking about walking away from more money than most people can imagine. For what? A life of splitting firewood and living paycheck to paycheck? I'm talking about walking away from money I never asked for to stay with the man I love. The words hung in the air between them, the first time either of them had used that particular word. Unless you're trying to tell me you want me to go, Thomas felt his heart break and mend and break again in the space of a single breath. She loved him, this incredible woman who'd brought music back into his life, who'd taught him that healing was possible, who'd made him remember what it felt like to hope for tomorrow. She loved him. And he was going to lose her. It's not about what I want, he said, standing up abruptly and moving to the window where he could see the mountain peaks that had been his refuge for so long. It's about what's smart, what's practical. How can I ask you to give up $17 million for a life on Cold Mountain? You're not asking. I'm choosing. Sarah's voice was fierce now, passionate. Money doesn't mean anything if you're not happy. I learned that lesson when David died. We had savings, insurance, retirement plans, and none of it mattered when he was gone. Thomas turned to look at her, this woman who'd become essential to his happiness, and felt the familiar weight of loss pressing down on his chest. What happens when you get tired of this life? When winter gets too hard or isolation gets too lonely? What happens when you realize you gave up security for a man who can't even promise you tomorrow? What happens if I go to Boston and spend the rest of my life regretting the choice to prioritize money over love? Sarah stood up, moving to face him directly. "Thomas, I've been wealthy and I've been poor. I've been married and I've been alone. The only time I've been truly happy in the last 2 years is right here, with you." Thomas wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that love could triumph over practical considerations, but 15 years of loss had taught him that happiness was fragile, that circumstances could change in an instant, that the people you loved most could be taken away without warning. "You should go," he said quietly. "Take the inheritance, start fresh in Boston, find someone who can give you the life you deserve." Sarah stared at him like he'd slapped her. "Is that really what you want? For me to leave? I want you to be safe. I want you to have choices, options, security. I want you to never have to worry about money or survival or whether your truck will make it through another winter." Thomas forced himself to meet her eyes. "I can't give you those things, but this inheritance can. And what about love? What about partnership, companionship, building something meaningful together?" Sarah's voice was rising now, fueled by hurt and frustration. "Do those things not matter? They matter more than you know." Thomas felt his own voice break slightly. "But they're not enough to justify asking you to walk away from this opportunity." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. When she finally spoke, her voice was deadly calm. "You're not protecting me, Thomas. You're protecting yourself. You're so afraid of losing me that you're pushing me away first." The accusation hit its mark with surgical precision. Thomas felt the truth of it settle into his bones, the recognition that fear was driving his response more than practical concern. "For Sarah's welfare, maybe I am," he admitted. "But that doesn't change the math. $17 million versus a life on Cold Mountain with a man who spent 15 years hiding from the world. It's not a fair choice. It's not your choice to make," Sarah said firmly. "It's mine, and I choose you. I choose this life, this place, this chance at happiness we've found together." Thomas looked at this remarkable woman who was willing to sacrifice a fortune for love, and felt his heart break all over again. Because he knew, with the certainty of someone who'd lost everything once before, that he couldn't let her do it. "The answer is still no," he said quietly. "I won't be responsible for you walking away from this inheritance. I won't be the reason. You regret the biggest decision of your life." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, tears gathering in her eyes. "So you're making the decision for me? You're deciding that money is more important than love, that security matters more than happiness. I'm deciding that I love you too much to let you make a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life." "The only mistake I would regret," Sarah said, her voice breaking, "is leaving the only place I've ever felt like I belonged." She walked out of the kitchen then, leaving Thomas alone with the legal documents and the devastating knowledge that he was about to lose the best thing that had happened to him in 15 years, because he loved her too much to let her stay. The next 17 days passed like a slow-motion catastrophe. Thomas threw himself into finishing the rocking chair with desperate intensity, working from dawn until well past dark, as if completion could somehow make sense of the chaos his life had become. Sarah maintained her duties around the cabin with mechanical precision, cooking meals he barely tasted, maintaining routines that felt increasingly hollow. They spoke when necessary, about groceries, about weather, about the practical details of daily survival. But the easy intimacy they'd built over months of shared mornings and quiet evenings had been replaced by a politeness so careful it felt like walking on ice. Thomas told himself he was doing the right thing. Every time he wavered, every time he caught himself wanting to beg Sarah to stay, he forced himself to remember the numbers. $17 million, $2 million a year in income. A lifetime of security versus a lifetime of uncertainty on Cold Mountain. But late at night, lying alone in his bed while Sarah slept in the room below, he wondered if he was the biggest fool who'd ever lived. The rocking chair was nearly complete now, the final pieces fitted and ready for assembly. Thomas had solved the joinery problems that had stymied him for 15 years, created connections so precise they seemed to defy physics. Every curve was perfect, every carved rose detailed enough to fool the eye into seeing real petals. It was the finest piece he'd ever created, and it was being built for a woman who would never sit in it. On the 15th day, Sarah received a call from the law firm in Boston. Thomas could hear her side of the conversation from his workshop. Polite. Responses to questions about travel arrangements, housing options, the logistics of establishing residency. When she hung up, the silence that followed felt like a death knell. That evening she began packing. Thomas watched from the kitchen window as she carried her worn suitcase from the bedroom to the front porch, the same suitcase that had held all her worldly possessions when she'd first arrived. Somehow, after 3 months of shared life, it still contained everything she owned. The realization hit him like a physical blow, how completely she'd integrated into his world while leaving. So little material trace of her presence. "The bus to Denver leaves day after tomorrow," Sarah said when she came back inside. "I can catch a flight to Boston from there." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. 2 days. 48 hours, and then Sarah Mitchell would walk out of his life as suddenly as she'd entered it. "What will you do with the inheritance?" he asked, because he needed to fill the silence with something other than his own regrets. "I don't know yet. Probably sell the properties, donate most of the money to charity, keep enough to be comfortable, but not enough to feel guilty." Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather rather than life-altering wealth. "David always said money was a tool, not a goal. I think he'd approve of using it to help other people." The casual way she discussed giving away millions of dollars only emphasized what Thomas was losing. This woman who could walk away from unimaginable wealth without a second thought, who measured success in kindness rather than accumulation. She was about to disappear from his life forever. "That sounds like something David would say," Thomas managed. "He was a good man. He taught me that happiness comes from how you live, not what you own." Sarah's smile was sad but genuine. "I think you would have liked him. I think I would have, too." They prepared dinner together one last time, moving around each other in the kitchen with the choreographed precision of partners who'd learned each other's rhythms. Sarah made her famous cornbread, the recipe she'd finally perfected using his temperamental wood-burning oven. Thomas grilled venison steaks from the deer he'd taken early in the season, the meat tender and flavorful from proper aging. It should have been a celebration of everything they'd learned together, all the ways they'd adapted to each other's presence. Instead, it felt like a wake. "I want you to know," Sarah said as they sat down to eat, "that these months with you have been the happiest of my adult life. Not just since David died, since before I ever met him. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." Thomas looked across the table at this woman who'd transformed his existence simply by being willing to see him as more than his grief, and felt his carefully constructed resolve begin to crumble. "What's that?" he asked. "Hope," Sarah said simply. "The belief that life can surprise you, that it's possible to start over no matter how old you are or how much you've lost. You've taught me that love doesn't have an expiration date." The words hit Thomas like a sledgehammer to the chest. Here was Sarah, about to leave for a new life because he'd insisted she take it, telling him that he'd given her hope. The irony was so bitter, he could taste it. "Sarah," he started, then stopped, unsure what he could possibly say that would make any of this hurt less. "It's okay," she said gently. "I understand why you can't ask me to stay. After Rebecca, after 15 years of protecting yourself from loss, I understand why $17 million feels safer than taking a chance on love. It's not about safety," Thomas protested. "It's about what's best for you." "Is it?" Sarah's voice was quiet but direct. "Or is it about what feels safest for you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're choosing the certainty of losing me over the risk of keeping me." Thomas stared at his plate, unable to meet her eyes, because he knew she was right. Fear was driving his decision more than practical. Concern for her welfare, fear of loss, fear of vulnerability, fear of caring so deeply about someone that their absence could destroy him again. "I can't go through that again," he admitted quietly. "Losing Rebecca nearly killed me. I can't survive watching someone else I love walk away. So instead, you're making me walk away now." Sarah's voice held no accusation, just sad understanding. "You're guaranteeing the loss you're afraid of experiencing." The logic was inescapable, devastating in its clarity. Thomas had spent 15 years hiding on Cold Mountain to avoid the pain of loss, only to create the exact scenario he'd been trying to prevent. After dinner, Sarah retreated to her room to finish packing, while Thomas worked on the final assembly of the rocking chair. Each joint fitted perfectly, the pieces coming together with the satisfying precision of a master craftsman's work. By midnight, it was complete. The most beautiful piece of furniture he'd ever created, built with techniques that pushed the boundaries of what wood could do. He carried it to Sarah's room and knocked softly on her door. "Come in," she called. Thomas entered to find her sitting on the bed, surrounded by the few possessions she'd accumulated during her time on the mountain. A flannel shirt he'd given her when the weather turned cold, a pair of wool socks she'd bought in Pine Ridge, the book of poetry they'd read together by firelight. "I wanted to give you this," Thomas said, setting the rocking chair beside her bed. "It's finished." Sarah looked at the chair with wonder, running her hands along the carved roses, testing the gentle motion of the rockers. In the soft lamplight, the wood seemed to glow with inner warmth, every detail perfect and lovingly rendered. "Thomas, it's magnificent," she breathed, "but I can't take this. It was meant for Rebecca." "It was started for Rebecca," Thomas corrected, "but it was finished for you. She would have wanted you to have it, something beautiful to remember this place by." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she continued to examine the chair, understanding the significance of what he was offering. This wasn't just furniture. It was 15 years of suspended grief transformed into something beautiful, proof that love could create lasting meaning even in the face of loss. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll treasure it always." They stood in the quiet room, surrounded by the evidence of her departure, and Thomas felt the last of his resistance crumble. Tomorrow, Sarah would board a bus and disappear from his life. The day after that, Cold Mountain would return to its 15-year silence, and he would return to his careful routine of survival without living. "Sarah," he said, her name a prayer, and a surrender. "I know," she said, moving into his arms. "I love you too." When he kissed her this time, it was with the desperate intensity of a man trying to memorize everything about a moment he knew he'd never experience again. Sarah kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt as if she could hold on to him through sheer force of will. They made love that night, with the bittersweet passion of people saying goodbye, every touch weighted with the knowledge that it might be the last. Thomas tried to memorize everything, the sound of Sarah's breathing, the way she felt in his arms, the soft words of love she whispered against his neck. When morning came, he would have to let her go. But for one night, they belonged completely to each other, love triumphant over fear and practical considerations and the weight of $17 million. For one night, they were enough. The morning of Sarah's departure dawned grey and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that promised snow before nightfall. Thomas loaded her suitcase and the carefully wrapped rocking chair into the back of his pickup truck, the same vehicle that had carried him up Cold Mountain 15 years ago and hadn't descended since. His hands shook as he fitted the keys into the ignition. Sarah sat beside him in the passenger seat, wearing the wool coat she'd arrived in, and the determined expression of someone trying to be brave. They'd barely spoken since waking, both of them understanding that words would only make the leaving harder. The truck coughed to life after several attempts, engine protesting the cold and the years of disuse. Thomas had maintained it mechanically, changed the oil, kept the battery charged, replaced worn belts, but he'd never actually driven it anywhere. Now, faced with the prospect of navigating mountain roads he hadn't traveled in 15 years, he felt a familiar surge of panic. "You don't have to come," Sarah said quietly as he wrestled the transmission into gear. "I can call a taxi from Pine Ridge." "I'm taking you to the bus station," Thomas said firmly. It was the least he could do. See her safely to her new life, even if he couldn't be part of it. The drive down Cold Mountain was a study in barely controlled terror. The dirt road that led from his cabin to the county highway was rutted and narrow, made treacherous by patches of ice that had formed during the previous night's freeze. Thomas drove with white-knuckled concentration, hyper-aware of Sarah's presence beside him and the precious cargo in the truck bed. Every mile that passed felt like a small death. These were roads he'd traveled with Rebecca, landscapes that held 15 years of memories. The creek where he'd learned to fly fish, the meadow where he'd cut hay for the first cabin he'd built, the overlook where you could see 3 states. On a clear day, all of it rushing past the truck windows like scenes from someone else's life. "Pull over," Sarah said suddenly when they were halfway to town. Thomas looked at her in alarm. "Are you sick? Car sick?" "No, just, please, pull over." He guided the truck to a wide spot beside the road, a place where the mountain fell away to reveal the valley spread out below. Pine Ridge was visible in the distance, a small cluster of buildings surrounded by ranchland and the geometric patterns of irrigated fields. Sarah got out of the truck and walked to the edge of the overlook, her hair whipping in the cold wind. Thomas followed, concerned by the tension in her shoulders and the way she stood as if poised for flight. "I can't do this," she said, without turning around. Thomas felt his heart stop. "Can't do what?" "I can't get on that bus. I can't go to Boston and pretend to be grateful for money I never wanted." Sarah turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I can't walk away from the only place I've ever felt like I belonged." "Sarah, you have to. The inheritance. Damn the inheritance!" The words exploded out of her with surprising vehemence. "I don't want it. I never wanted it. I want this, us, the mountain, the life we built together. I want to wake up every morning, knowing I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Thomas felt something break open in his chest, hope and terror warring for dominance. "You can't mean that. $17 million is just paper," Sarah finished. "Numbers in a bank account. It can't hold you when you're scared. Can't make you laugh when you're sad. Can't love you back when you need it most." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "You can, Thomas. You do. What about security? What about your future?" "My future is standing right in front of me, trying to convince me to choose money over happiness." Sarah reached for his hands, gripping them tightly. "Thomas, I've been wealthy and I've been poor. I've been married and I've been alone. The only time I've been truly alive in the last 2 years is with you on Cold Mountain, building something real." Thomas stared at this remarkable woman who was willing to walk away from generational wealth for love, and felt his carefully constructed defenses finally crumble completely. What if you regret it? What if you wake up in 5 years and wish you'd taken the money? What if you wake up in 5 years and wish you'd fought for us instead of pushing me away? Sarah's voice was fierce now, passionate. What if we spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been because we were too afraid to take a chance on love? The questions hit Thomas like physical blows, each one highlighting the magnitude of what he was about to lose. This woman who loved him despite his scars, who'd brought music back into his life, who'd taught him that healing was possible, she was choosing him over unimaginable wealth, and he was still trying to talk her out of it. "I'm scared," he admitted, quietly. "So am I." Sarah moved closer, close enough that he could feel her warmth despite the cold wind. "But I'm more scared of living without you than I am of taking a chance on us." Thomas looked down at this woman who'd become essential to his happiness, who'd shown him that love was worth the risk of loss, and felt something shift inside him, not breaking, but opening, like a door that had been locked for 15 years, finally swinging free. "The bus leaves in an hour," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Then we need to decide right now," Sarah said. "Together. Do we get on that bus and spend the rest of our lives wondering what if? Or do we go home and build something beautiful? Home." She'd called Cold Mountain home, and Thomas realized that was exactly what it had become. Not just his refuge from the world, but their sanctuary. The place where two broken people had learned to love again. He looked at the valley spread, out below them, at the town where Sarah's bus waited, at the road that led back up the mountain to the life they'd built together. For 15 years, fear had made his choices for him. Fear of loss, fear of vulnerability, fear of caring too deeply about someone who might leave. But standing here with Sarah, feeling the fierce love that radiated from her like warmth from a fire, Thomas realized that the greatest fear should be the fear of not living at all. "Let's go home," he said simply. Sarah's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, brilliant and warming and full of infinite possibility. "Are you sure?" Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, where his heart was beating strong and steady for the first time in years. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." When he kissed her, it was with the knowledge that they were choosing each other over safety, love over security, hope over fear. It was a kiss that tasted like second chances and new beginnings, like promises kept and dreams fulfilled. Behind them, the truck waited to carry them back up Cold Mountain, back to the life they'd chosen together, over all the practical reasons why they shouldn't. They drove back up Cold Mountain in jubilant silence, hands clasped across the truck's bench seat, the weight of their decision settling around them like a warm blanket. The grey sky that had seemed ominous during their descent now felt pregnant with possibility. Even the rutted dirt road seemed less treacherous, as if the mountain itself approved of their choice. But as they pulled into the clearing around Thomas's cabin, reality began to assert itself. Sarah would miss the inheritance deadline. There would be legal consequences, financial implications, a life in Boston that would have to be declined. The lawyers would need to be contacted. Arrangements would have to be made. "I should call the law firm," Sarah said, as they unloaded her suitcase and the rocking chair. "Let them know I won't be claiming the inheritance." Thomas felt a stab of panic as the practical implications hit him. "Sarah, wait. Maybe we should think about this more. There might be options we haven't considered. Ways to claim part of the inheritance while staying here. Legal alternatives." Thomas." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "Are you having second thoughts?" He looked at her, standing in the afternoon light, surrounded by the life they'd built together, and felt the truth settle into his bones. "No. No second thoughts. I just want to make sure you won't regret this choice. The only thing I would regret is not making it." Sarah moved to him, placing her hands on his chest, where his heart was beating fast with nervous energy. "But there's something I need to tell you first. Something I should have mentioned about the inheritance." Thomas felt a new kind of fear creep up his spine. "What kind of something?" Sarah took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for his reaction. "The residency requirement isn't just about living in Boston. It's about being unmarried." Aunt Millicent apparently had very specific ideas about how her money should be used. "If I get married within the first year, the inheritance goes to charity instead." The words hit Thomas like a thunderbolt. Marriage. The concept hadn't even occurred to him. They'd been so focused on the simple choice of staying or leaving that they hadn't discussed the future beyond tomorrow. "So if you and I," Thomas struggled to find the words, "if we got married, I'd lose the inheritance anyway." Sarah's smile was soft but determined. "Which makes the choice a lot easier, doesn't it? I can walk away from $17 million for love, or I can walk away from $17 million for love. Either way, the money was never really mine to keep." Thomas stared at this woman who continued to amaze him with her capacity for grace under pressure, for finding silver linings in impossible situations. "You're telling me that choosing to stay here means choosing marriage?" I'm telling you that the inheritance was designed to keep me isolated and alone, just like Aunt Millicent was. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more certain. I refuse to let a dead woman's bitterness dictate how I live my life. I refuse to choose money over love, security over happiness, fear over hope. Thomas felt something click into place, a sense of rightness that went deeper than logic or practical considerations. This was why Sarah had appeared in his life when she did, not just to heal his grief, but to offer him a chance at the kind of love he'd thought was lost forever. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, dropping to one knee right there in the dirt beside his truck. "Will you marry me?" Sarah's laugh was bright and joyful, full of surprise and delight. "Thomas Kane, are you proposing to me in your driveway?" "I'm proposing to you on Cold Mountain, the place where we found each other," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket for something he'd been carrying for the past week without really understanding why. Rebecca's wedding ring, the one he'd worn on a chain around his neck for 15 years, the one he'd finally removed the night Sarah had first kissed him. "This was Rebecca's," he said, holding up the simple gold band. "She would have wanted you to have it, wanted us to build something new while honoring what came before. But if you'd rather have something that's just ours—" "It's perfect," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's absolutely perfect." Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how right it looked there, how completely it seemed to belong. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes to everything," Sarah said, pulling him to his feet and into her arms. "Yes to marriage, yes to Cold Mountain, yes to building a life together, yes to choosing love over everything else." When they kissed this time, it was with the knowledge that they were no longer just two people finding comfort in each other's company. They were partners, committed to facing whatever challenges came next as a team. The kiss tasted like promises and new beginnings, like the kind of love that could weather any storm. "When?" Thomas asked when they finally broke apart. "As soon as possible," Sarah said with the decisiveness that had first attracted him to her. "Before I lose my nerve. Before you start overthinking this, before anything else can go wrong." Thomas laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Tomorrow's Friday. We could drive to Pine Ridge, get a license, and ask Pastor Williams to perform the ceremony," Sarah finished. "I met him at the general store last week. He seemed like a kind man." "He married Rebecca and me," Thomas said, then stopped, worried. He'd said the wrong thing, but Sarah's smile only grew brighter. "Then he's perfect, Rebecca's blessing on our beginning." That evening they called the law firm in Boston to formally decline the inheritance. The lawyer who took Sarah's call was professionally neutral, but Thomas could hear the disapproval in his clipped responses. $17 million didn't get refused often, and certainly not for something as impractical as love. "Are you certain about this decision, Ms. Mitchell?" the lawyer asked, during what was clearly a final attempt to change her mind. "This inheritance represents financial security for multiple generations. Once declined, it cannot be reclaimed." "I'm certain," Sarah said, looking at Thomas as she spoke. "I found something more valuable than money. And what might that be?" "Home," Sarah said simply, and Thomas felt his heart swell with pride and love and the absolute certainty that they were making the right choice. After the call, they sat together on the front porch in the gathering darkness, wrapped in quilts, and watching the first stars appear over Cold Mountain. The rocking chair sat between them, perfect in its completion, a symbol of everything they'd learned about love and loss and the courage required to begin again. "No regrets?" Thomas asked, as Sarah's head found its way to his shoulder. "Only that it took us so long to get here," Sarah said softly. "But maybe we needed all those years of separate healing before we could find each other." Thomas thought about the 15 years he'd spent on Cold Mountain, learning to live with grief, discovering that solitude could be healing rather than just hiding. Sarah's 2 years of widowhood, her own journey through loss toward acceptance. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps their individual paths had been necessary preparation for this moment, this choice, this chance at love redeemed. Tomorrow will be married, he said, still marveling at the reality of it. Tomorrow we'll be officially what we already are, Sarah corrected. Partners, companions, two people who chose each other over everything else the world had to offer. As if in celebration of their decision, the first snow of winter began to fall. Soft, gentle flakes that caught the light from their windows and transformed the world into something magical. Thomas watched it accumulate on the porch railing, on Sarah's hair, on the mountains that had sheltered his grief and now would witness his joy. Cold Mountain would have new stories to tell, not just about a man who came there to hide from love, but about two people who found it in the most unlikely place and had the courage to choose it over safety, over security, over 17 million reasons to make a different decision. Some things, Thomas thought as he held his soon-to-be wife close, were worth more than money could ever buy. 6 months later, Sarah Kane sat in the rocking chair on the front porch of their expanded cabin, watching her husband split firewood with the same methodical precision he brought to everything in his life. The morning sun caught the silver threads that had appeared in his dark hair over the winter, and she marveled at how completely this mountain man had transformed from the isolated hermit she'd first encountered. The wedding had been simple, beautiful, exactly what they'd both wanted. Pastor Williams had performed the ceremony in the small church in Pine Ridge, with Dr. Martinez and his wife serving as witnesses. Sarah had worn the blue dress she'd packed in her worn suitcase 6 months earlier, and Thomas had surprised her with a hand-carved wooden wedding band to match Rebecca's gold ring. 2 rings for 2 kinds of love, he'd explained as he'd slipped it onto her finger. The gold to honor what came before, the wood to celebrate what we're building together. Now, Sarah twisted both rings on her finger as she watched Thomas work, remembering their wedding night when they'd returned to Cold Mountain as husband and wife. The cabin had felt different somehow. Not just Thomas's space that she was sharing, but truly theirs, a home they'd chosen together. The inheritance money was gone, donated to charities that helped widows and widowers rebuild their lives after loss. Sarah had kept just enough to buy Thomas a new truck, one that actually started reliably and could navigate mountain roads in all weather. He'd protested the expense until she'd pointed out that emergencies required dependable transportation, and his safety was worth more to her than any amount of money. Besides, she'd said, what's the point of having a husband if I can't spoil him occasionally? Their life had settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and new. Thomas had taken on additional carpentry commissions, his reputation for exceptional craftsmanship spreading through word of mouth. Sarah had started a small business of her own, making quilts and preserves that she sold at the farmer's market in Pine Ridge. They worked together, played together, built their future one careful choice at a time. The cabin itself had grown to accommodate their shared life. Thomas had added a larger kitchen, a proper guest room, and a sunroom where Sarah could work on her quilts during the long winter months. The expansion had been carefully planned to complement the original structure, additions that honored the past while embracing the future, but it was the small changes that meant the most. Fresh flowers on the kitchen table, 2 coffee mugs instead of 1. Books scattered throughout the house instead of lined up in perfect order. The chess set had been moved to the front porch, where they played evening games while watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Penny for your thoughts," Thomas said, settling onto the porch steps with a glass of the lemonade Sarah had made from the Meyer lemons Dr. Martinez brought back from his winter vacation in Arizona. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Sarah said, gesturing toward the valley below where spring was transforming the landscape from winter brown to fresh green. 6 months ago, I thought my life was effectively over. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Thomas followed her gaze to the mountains that had sheltered their love through its tentative beginning and would witness whatever came next. Any regrets about the inheritance? It was a question he'd asked periodically over the winter, always with the tone of someone genuinely concerned about her welfare. Sarah's answer had never varied. "None," she said firmly. "Money can't buy what we have here. It can't buy the sound of your voice reading to me by firelight, or the way you sing off-key while you work, or the feeling of waking up every morning knowing I'm exactly where I belong." "I don't sing off-key," Thomas protested with mock indignation. "Darling, you couldn't carry a tune if it had handles," Sarah said, laughing at his wounded expression. "But I love it anyway. I love everything about this life we've built." Thomas moved to sit beside her, close enough that she could lean against his shoulder and feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. They'd developed dozens of these small intimacies. Over the months, ways of touching and being close that spoke of deep affection and complete comfort with each other. "I got a call from the employment agency today," Thomas said casually. "They wanted to know if we needed any additional help around the place." Sarah looked up at him with sudden alertness. "What did you tell them? That we were managing fine on our own?" Thomas's smile was soft, private. "But it got me thinking about how different things might have been if you'd never answered that original posting." "If the agency had sent someone else, you mean?" "If they'd sent anyone else," Thomas agreed. "Or if you'd taken one look at this place and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. If you'd been less patient with a cranky hermit who'd forgotten how to be around people." Sarah considered the alternative timeline he was proposing, a world where they'd never met, where she'd gone to Boston to claim an inheritance she'd never wanted, where Thomas had remained alone on Cold Mountain with only his grief for company. The thought made her shudder. "I don't think there was ever really a choice," she said finally. "From the moment I saw this place, saw you, I knew I was home. It just took me a while to admit it to myself, even when I was actively trying to push." "You away?" "Especially then," Sarah said with a laugh. "Nothing makes a woman more determined than a man who thinks he knows what's best for her." Thomas winced at the memory of his misguided attempts to convince her to take the inheritance. "I was an idiot." "You were scared," Sarah corrected gently. "And you'd spent 15 years learning to protect yourself from loss. It's natural that you'd try to control the situation rather than risk being hurt again. What about you? Were you scared?" Sarah considered the question seriously. She had been terrified of making the wrong choice, of giving up security for an uncertain future, of loving someone enough to risk losing them. But the fear had been overridden by something stronger. "Terrified," she admitted, "but more afraid of living a safe, empty life than of taking a chance on love. David always said that regret was heavier than failure, and I couldn't bear the thought of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light shift across the valley below. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled on thermal currents, riding the mountain air with effortless grace. Sarah had learned to identify the local wildlife over the winter, the different bird calls, the tracks various animals left in the snow, the signs that indicated changing weather patterns. "I love how quiet it is here," she said eventually. "Not empty quiet, but peaceful quiet, like the mountain is holding its breath, waiting to see what we'll do next." "What do you want to do next?" Thomas asked, and something in his tone made Sarah look at him more closely. "What do you mean?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, as if gathering courage for whatever he was about to say. When he finally spoke, his voice held the same nervous energy she remembered from their early days together. "I mean, what do you want our life to look like 5 years from now, 10 years? Do you want to stay here forever, or do you think you might get tired of the isolation? Do you want to travel, see other places? Do you want—" He paused, then rushed ahead. "Do you want children?" The question hung in the mountain air between them, weighted with significance. Sarah had wondered when this conversation would come up, had been preparing for it without really knowing what her answer would be. "I want whatever life we can build together," she said carefully. "Travel sounds wonderful, as long as we always come back here. This place will always be home, no matter where else we might go. And children?" Sarah felt her heart squeeze with old longing and new possibility. "I'd love to have children with you, if that's something you want. But I need you to know that I'm 43 years old. The chances of natural conception are better than you think, Thomas interrupted gently. Dr. Martinez mentioned adoption options too, if that's something you'd consider. Older children who need families, kids who've been overlooked by people wanting babies. Sarah stared at her husband, this man who continued to surprise her with his depth and thoughtfulness. You've been researching this. I've been hoping, Thomas corrected. Hoping that maybe we could give some child the kind of love and stability that Cold Mountain can provide. Hoping that maybe the next chapter of our story could include expanding our family. The image of children playing in the meadow behind their cabin, of teaching them to split wood and identify bird calls and appreciate the profound peace of mountain living, filled Sarah with a longing so strong it took her breath away. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. Children travel whatever adventures come next, as long as we face them together. Thomas's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. Together, he agreed, and kissed her with the promise of all the tomorrows they would share. As evening settled over Cold Mountain, Sarah Kane rocked gently in the chair her husband had finished for love, surrounded by the life they'd chosen. Over safety, over security, over 17 million reasons to make different choices. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, the promise of summer warmth and autumn colors and winter snows that would find them still here, still together, still amazed by their good fortune in finding each other. Sometimes, the loneliest souls really were the ones who'd convinced themselves they didn't need anybody. Sometimes it really did take just one gentle heart to remind them what they'd been missing all along. And sometimes, if they were very lucky and very brave, they found the courage to choose love over fear, hope over safety, and the uncertain beauty of building something new together over the comfortable pain of staying alone. Cold Mountain had witnessed many stories over the centuries. Tales of survival and struggle, of dreams deferred and hopes abandoned. But now, it held a different kind of story, one written in the sound of shared laughter, the rhythm of rocking chairs on front porches, and the quiet contentment of two hearts that had finally found their way home.